The first thing you notice tonight, before the story even begins, is the stillness in the air, that quiet, anticipatory breath a winter landscape takes just before it tightens its grip on everything it touches. And as you settle under your blanket and let your eyes grow heavy, I want you to imagine, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but slowly, like mist rolling across an icy river, the world of early America, long before roads were roads and before comfort was anything more than a passing luxury. And as you let that picture form, I'll ask you gently to like the video only if you feel connected to what we build here together, and to leave a comment with your location and the time it is for you right now, because there is something strangely beautiful about people from different places gathering around one quiet story, as if around a shared fire. Now dim the lights, soften your breathing, and step with me into a place where the cold is not just a temperature but a presence that watches, listens, and waits. You find yourself standing at the edge of a forest, the color of steel, the trees rising tall and narrow like pillars carved from frost, and the air is so crisp that every breath feels like a small crystal forming in your lungs. Behind you, a rough-hewn cabin leans into the clearing, its chimney releasing a thin ribbon of wood smoke that curls into the dusk like a faint prayer, and at your feet the ground is already hard in places, frozen despite the late autumn leaves that still lie scattered across it like faded memories of warmth. The trail beneath you crackles softly as you walk, each step sounding like broken glass, and the forest closes in on both sides, not menacing, not welcoming, simply existing with the calm indifference of wilderness, untouched by the ambitions of man. The scent of pine resin drifts through the air, mixing with the damp musk of old earth and the sweetness of decaying leaves, and somewhere above a crow calls sharply, as if announcing that the last fragile threads of autumn are snapping one by one. The frontier, 2 centuries ago, was not a storybook landscape, but a raw, unknown expanse stretching beyond imagination, and the people who pushed westward carried more hope than knowledge, more courage than preparation, bringing with them only what they could load onto a wagon, and what they could promise themselves in the quiet moments before sleep. Many of them had never seen a winter without neighbors close enough to hear a shout or a market nearby to restock dwindling stores. And so when the first frost appeared, glistening silver across branches and roof beams, it was both a beautiful sight and a warning whispered through every root and stone. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, feeling the cold settle into your bones with the same patient certainty that it must have settled into theirs, and you picture those first settlers working the land with hands already stiff from the chill, some racing desperately to finish 4 walls and a roof before the snows closed in, others lingering too long and finding themselves trapped in half-built shelters when storms arrived early, leaving them exposed to a season that forgave nothing and forgot no one. Even now, as you stand on that imagined trail, you can sense how deceptive the peace of an early frontier winter could be. The forest grows quiet, the river slows under a thin crust of forming ice, the sky turns that unmistakable pale blue that promises beauty by day and biting cold by night. And yet somewhere beyond the tree line, a storm is already gathering, one of those vast white tempests capable of burying entire settlements beneath its weight. There is wonder in it too. Strangely enough, you notice frost forming on your mittens like spun glass, each breath emerging in a soft plume that feels somehow more alive than the air of summer ever did, and you realize, as many settlers once wrote, that winter was a season of contradictions, death intertwined with purity, silence interwoven with survival, hardship wrapped around moments of startling beauty. A woman on the Pennsylvania frontier once described winter as the time when life hid beneath the surface, so it could return renewed in spring. And as you picture her tending a small fire while her children sleep under quilts patched from worn-out clothing, you feel a quiet admiration rise in your chest, because in places like this, winter was not an obstacle but a force you learned to live with, negotiate with, and endure. Time begins to lose its edges as the colors around you fade to shades of gray and white. Even the sound of your footsteps softens until it seems the world is holding its breath. And you understand why settlers measured their year not by months but by tasks, marking time by the last harvest, the first freeze, the first night the well water turned to ice, each moment a small alarm bell reminding them that vigilance was the only currency winter respected. By December, life shifted entirely. Days shrank into pale slivers of daylight. Hands grew calloused and red from cold, and every chore became a negotiation between necessity and fatigue. Hauling water, chopping wood, repairing tools, each action was performed with a quiet efficiency born not of strength, but of repetition, routine, and resilience. There is one strange detail that frontier families often wrote about, and as you walk deeper into the forest you begin to hear it too. The trees around you crack, loud and sudden, like distant gunfire, the sap inside each trunk frozen and expanding, until the wood splits under the pressure. Settlers called it the forest's gunfire, a sound both eerie and magnificent, that signaled the coldest nights and reminded everyone that everything in the wilderness, including the trees, was under stress. Historians still debate which winter was the deadliest, whether it was 1780 when the Hudson froze solid and sea ice pushed as far south as the Carolinas, or 1816, the infamous year without a summer, when volcanic ash from halfway around the world dimmed the sun and ruined crops across the continent. But in truth the story remains the same across them all. Families huddling by faint fires, counting dwindling food stores, whispering quiet prayers that spring would come before hunger did. You reach the cabin door and rest your hand upon it, the wood cold enough to sting your palm, and you look once more toward the forest before stepping inside. Snow begins to fall softly, each flake settling on your cloak, melting on your lips like a fleeting reminder that winter is not an enemy, but a lesson in patience, humility, and endurance. Inside, the fire flickers weakly, not much, but enough, and as you close the door behind you and feel the first thin wave of warmth brush your skin, you realize that everything from this moment forward, every decision and every small movement, will be shaped by the relentless cold waiting just outside the walls. You wake to the thin morning light seeping through the cracks between the logs, the fire reduced to faint orange embers buried under ash. Your breath fogs in the air, and the blanket around your shoulders feels more symbolic than warm, and you realize, as the settlers once did, that a cabin is more than shelter. It is a declaration of will, a fragile but brave attempt to carve a small pocket of life from a vast indifferent wilderness. And this is where your real story begins. You wake again in that same cabin, though in truth it feels more like a skeleton of a home than a finished place to live, and for a moment you lie still, listening to the soft creak of timber shifting in the cold and the faint whisper of wind pushing through hairline cracks. You cannot yet see, but certainly can feel. Your breath hangs in front of your face like a small ghost before fading into the chill air, and as you pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders, you understand something that every frontier family discovered sooner or later. This place of rough logs and packed earth is not a simple house. It is a shield, a handmade barrier between your fragile warmth and an endless, hungry winter. Long before the first snow ever touched the ground, the real work of that shield began, not in some romantic rush of building in a storm, but in long, repetitive days of labor when the land was still soft enough to dig, and the trees still heavy with sap. You can see yourself there, earlier in the year, standing with an axe in both hands, the smell of fresh pine sharp in your nose, every swing ringing through the valley with a hollow, rhythmic thud, chips of bark and pale wood flying around your boots, like a strange wooden snowstorm marking each moment of progress. Choosing the spot for this cabin was a quiet act of wisdom disguised as practicality, because the early settlers learned, often the hard way, that where you put your walls mattered as much as how you built them. They searched for high ground that would not flood when spring melted the rivers, for a curve in the hill or a stand of trees that could break the worst of the wind, for a place open enough to drink in what little winter sunlight there was, and yet close enough to the forest to draw logs and firewood without walking miles through drifts, and some even turn their doors south to capture more light on short dim days, a simple adjustment that could mean the difference between bitter cold and bearable chill. Once a site was chosen, time narrowed to a single command: build before the frost comes, or risk not seeing another spring. And so the first structure raised was often not even a full cabin, but a crude half-faced camp, 3 walls and a sloping roof of branches and bark, something barely worthy of the name shelter, but just enough to sleep under, while the true home rose layer by layer. You can imagine those days, the forest full of the smell of sap and fresh-cut wood, your fingers sticky from resin, your shoulders aching from lifting logs as broad as your chest and heaving them into place. Each log must be notched carefully at the ends, fitted against the next with surprising precision for such rough materials, and the gaps between them filled with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes even animal hair, a humble combination that settlers called chinking, which looked crude to the eye but could block a great deal of the wind when pressed deep into every crack. As you run your hand along the inside wall, you feel where those seams have dried and hardened, how each packed line represents time and intention, a quiet promise made to your own future self, that the cold will not enter unchecked. The floor beneath your feet is still mostly earth, tamped hard by boots and sometimes covered with straw or old skins to keep the damp from rising, and there are no polished boards, no nails glittering in the firelight, because nails are scarce and expensive, treasured things, and so the entire structure is held together by wooden pegs, careful notches, and the weight of the logs themselves. Even the simplest shelf or bench is a puzzle of mortise and tenon joints, relying on skill instead of hardware, and you understand why even a small draft feels like an insult to all that effort. When the real cold comes, it finds every flaw, every misjudged angle and hurried seam, and so much of life here becomes a conversation with your own handiwork, tracing the walls each morning with the back of your hand to search for icy threads of air, listening at night to the creaks and sighs of the timbers as they settle, learning which corner always captures a shadow of frost and which spot near the hearth stays warm longest. The cabin begins slowly to feel less like an object and more like a living thing, moaning and cracking in the cold, expanding, contracting, and answering the weather with its own wooden language. At one end of the single room, the fireplace crouches like a stone heart, built from fieldstones hauled from the nearest creek bed and stacked with as much care as the walls themselves. The chimney above it might be made of sticks daubed with clay, a design that saved time but carried risks. Many settlers learned about the hard way, when, after months of battling the cold, they found themselves fighting a different enemy, as sparks caught the chimney and sent fire racing upward through their own protection. You kneel now in front of that simple hearth, feeding it a few carefully chosen pieces of kindling, and you watch as the thin ember glow hidden in last night's ashes stirs, reddens, and flares into a narrow flame, the way a tired eye might open after deep sleep. There is something almost sacred about that moment, the revival of fire from coals that nearly died, and you can feel why families treated their hearth as more than just stone and ash, calling it the spirit of the house, the breathing center that turned 4 walls from a cold box into a place where life could continue. As the flames grow, they brush the rough-hewn rafters with flickering light, painting moving shadows across the bare logs, and you notice little touches that people in such harsh conditions still found time to add, bits of cloth tacked along the worst cracks, not just to stop drafts but to bring a scrap of color into the brown and grey world, a pair of antlers or an animal skull mounted above the door as both decoration and talisman, bunches of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, their leaves long since brittle, but their presence a faint reminder of green fields and warm days. Historians can argue all they like about whether such habits were superstition, practicality, or something in between. But as you sit there and feel the way your gaze returns again and again to those small touches, you realize they are simply the human need to claim a space as your own. to plant little flags of beauty in a landscape dominated by necessity and survival. When you step outside, the morning has sharpened, the sky a hard pale blue that almost hurts to look at, and you see your cabin casting a long dark shadow across the snow, the lines of its roof and walls stark against the whiteness. It is small, undeniably so, and you could walk from one end to the other in a handful of steps. Yet there is a solidity to it that feels almost monumental, because you know every log, every stone, every smear of clay was placed there by hand, each one a decision made under the constant, pressing awareness that winter was on its way. You stand there for a moment, boots sunk into the crust of snow, and you hear the forest shift around you, the faint groan of branches weighed down with ice, the distant crack of a trunk splitting in the cold, the soft whisper of wind threading between trees. Behind you the cabin door sits closed, a thin wooden barrier, and yet you know that inside, a small fire is pushing back against all of this, creating a pocket of warmth only a few feet thick, but infinitely precious. As the day unfolds, chores pull you back and forth between the inside world of chinking, patching, sweeping, and the outside world of hauling, chopping, and checking for damage, and you begin to feel that the cabin is not something you built once, but something you are constantly building, adjusting, and tending like a slow-growing companion. The logs shrink and settle over time, opening new gaps that must be filled. The roof sags under heavy snow and needs its burden knocked away with a pole, and each small repair becomes a kind of quiet conversation between you and the structure that shelters you. There is a certain comfort in that routine, especially for tired minds, inspecting the walls in the evening with a stub of candle, feeling along the seams for cold, tapping a loose peg more firmly into place, tugging on the shutter to be sure it holds against the night wind. Many settlers wrote that they came to recognize the sounds of their homes, the way a sharp snap in the beams often meant a deep cold coming, and a long low groan hinted at heavy snow inbound. And as you listen now, lying on your straw-filled mattress near the hearth, you too can hear that wooden language. A creak here, a sigh there, like the slow breathing of some big sleeping animal that has chosen to curl itself around you for protection. The cabin is far from perfect. The floor is uneven. The roof sometimes drips when the snow above begins to melt. Smoke does not always rise the way it should, and occasionally rolls back into the room, making your eyes water and lining the walls with soot. And yet for all its flaws, this place holds warmth, light, and the faint but real scent of food and fire. And when you think of the empty forest beyond its walls, or the open plains where wind slices without mercy, you feel a quiet gratitude for every rough beam and crooked stone. You sit again by the fire as evening deepens, your hands stretched out to the heat, and you look around at the bare walls and low rafters and realize that every inch of this modest space is a pact between you and the land. You have taken wood and stone and earth and shaped them into a refuge, and in return you have accepted a life of constant work, vigilance, and humility, in the face of a winter that will always be bigger than you. It is not a grand bargain, not one that would impress anyone used to comfortable homes and easy warmth, but here in the deep quiet of early American frontier winter, it is enough. The cabin breathes, the fire whispers, the logs crack softly in the settling cold, and outside the snow continues to fall in patient, silent layers, covering tracks and paths and old scars in the land. And you, wrapped in the muted glow of your handmade shelter, drift slowly towards sleep, knowing that for tonight at least, your shield against the cold still holds. You wake before dawn to a sound that feels both familiar and urgent. The clean, ringing thud of an axe splitting wood somewhere outside the cabin, each strike sharp enough to thread through the cold and echo against distant trees, like a church bell calling you into another day of survival. For a moment you lie there under your blanket, letting the rhythm settle into your bones, because on the frontier the sound of chopping was not mere labor but reassurance, a promise that warmth could still be earned one swing at a time. When you finally rise, the air inside the cabin is cold enough that your breath fogs instantly, curling upward in faint white streams that vanish near the rafters. You pull on your coat and step outside into a world washed pale by early morning light. The snow crisp under your boots, the scent of pine and frost sharp enough to sting your nostrils and wake every muscle in your body. The man chopping wood, sometimes yourself in this story, sometimes the shadow of a memory from settlers who lived centuries earlier, moves with unhurried, deliberate strength, his breath rising in clouds, his arms steady despite the bitter cold. Out here, wood is not simply fuel but the boundary between life and suffering. Warmth, food, sleep. Everything depends on maintaining a fire that never quite rests. Most frontier families burned through as much as 15 cords of wood in a single winter, a staggering amount that meant endless hours of chopping, hauling, stacking, and praying the supply would outlast the storms. People learned quickly that not all wood burned the same. Oak smouldered long and hot, perfect for overnight fires, while hickory produced fierce heat but spit sparks like musket fire, and pine, easy to cut and eager to burn, filled cabins with thick smoke that coated everything in soot. There was an old saying whispered with half a grin: "Cut pine and you'll cry twice, once when you chop it and once when you breathe it." You picture yourself gripping the axe handle, its worn wood fitting perfectly into your palms, the blade rising and falling in a rhythm that soon becomes something hypnotic. Swing, crack, breathe, repeat. The shock travels through your shoulders on every strike, the cold biting at your fingers even through gloves, and the air around you fills with the clean, almost sweet scent of freshly split logs. It is simple work, exhausting work, repetitive beyond measure, but it builds a quiet pride inside you because every piece of wood added to the growing pile represents another night of warmth pulled from the jaws of winter. Sometimes you pause and listen to the forest, how it groans under the cold, branches snapping with sudden rifle-like cracks as sap freezes inside them, each sound reminding you that the world out here is alive, but strained, as if everything organic is tightening, bracing, enduring. In the distance, a lone echo rolls across the trees, making you lift your head instinctively. Was it an animal, a shifting branch, or simply silence breaking itself apart? By late morning, the woodpile beside your cabin has grown into a sturdy, towering stack, its edges neat and its shape unmistakably purposeful. Some settlers named their piles half in jest, half in reverence. One man in New York referred to his as the silent guard, as if the logs were posted like sentries between his family and the cold. Others considered the woodpile a measure of a person's character. Neat and dry meant foresight and discipline, while a scattered, soggy heap meant carelessness that neighbors whispered about long after. Those whispers reveal something unspoken about frontier life, the way communities, small and scattered though they were, silently judged a person not by wealth or charm but by preparedness. A good woodpile was not only warmth but reputation. It declared that you respected the land enough to know it could kill you. Wood gathering was not always solitary either. By the early 1800s, woodbees gatherings where neighbors worked together became common across the frontier. Men chopped and split while women and older children collected kindling, their mittens stiff with frost, their breath rising in small clouds as they worked. It was one of the few times during winter when the loneliness of distance dissolved for a few precious hours. Tools rang against wood, stories were swapped, whiskey passed from hand to hand, and songs drifted through the trees. These gatherings were not just practical, they were a quiet celebration of community, a reminder that even in isolation, people survived together. You imagine the smell of burning sap drifting from a nearby fire where someone keeps a pot of stew simmering thin broth with pork and potatoes, the kind of meal eaten with hands too numb to feel the spoon but warm enough to carry a person through the rest of the day. It wasn't luxury, but it was comfort, and comfort was its own kind of wealth out here. As the sun sinks low, draining colour from the sky until everything takes on a muted blue cast, the forest seems to close in again, the cold deepening in steady waves. But the woodpile, your growing monument to persistence, glows faintly in the fading light, its shape reassuring as a lantern. You return inside your cabin where the fire crackles, throwing warm orange reflections across the rough-hewn walls. You feed it another log and watch the flames catch and rise, twisting upward like hungry fingers reaching for the rafters. The warmth seeps slowly into your bones, pleasing and heavy, easing the day's aches bit by bit. You think about the settlers who did not cut enough wood before winter, their grim stories scattered across diaries and local lore. Some families froze in cabins where the hearth died on the coldest nights. Others burned furniture, tool handles, even the frame of their beds to survive. One story tells of a family in Kentucky who dismantled their porch railings piece by piece just to keep their fire alive until March. It is impossible not to feel the weight of those stories as you sit by your own fire, the wood crackling steadily. The frontier never rewarded bravery alone. It rewarded consistency, the quiet kind built from daily effort, from rising each morning to swing the axe again, from tending the fire faithfully, from doing the small things well enough to survive the large things. Night settles fully around you now, the world outside muted under fresh snow, and the cabin glows with a softness that feels earned. You add one more log to the fire, watch it catch, and listen to the comforting crackle. Each ember, after all, began as a swing of the axe. Each hour of warmth is a memory of your own strength, and in that soft light, in that quiet space, the truth the frontier taught settles gently into your mind. You do not fight the cold. You feed it, one log at a time, and in return, it lets you live. You wake in the dim half-light of early morning, your breath drifting upward in thin ghostly ribbons, and for a moment you wonder whether the fire has died completely during the night. The room feels colder than before, the kind of cold that presses against your ribs when you inhale, sharp and intrusive, as if the air itself is reminding you how fragile warmth truly is on the frontier. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders and kneel by the hearth, stirring the ashes with a small stick. Beneath the grey dust a few coals flicker faintly, tiny stubborn hearts refusing to surrender. You blow gently, careful not to scatter the embers, and watch as the dull orange brightens, a thin tongue of flame beginning to rise, weak at first and then growing with quiet determination as you feed it dry twigs. The cabin warms slowly, so slowly that you barely feel it at first, but the soft spreading of heat across your hands brings a relief far greater than its temperature alone could justify. Frontier families called their fire the household spirit, because keeping it alive through winter nights was more than routine. It was survival in its most delicate form. Matches were rare and often unreliable, and flint took practice to use well, so people learned to treat flame as something precious, even sacred. When traveling between cabins, settlers carried live embers wrapped in bark or moss, cradling them the way someone today might carry a fragile heirloom. A spark meant the difference between warmth and frostbite, between a cooked meal and raw hunger, between a home and a frozen tomb. There are accounts from New England describing neighbors walking miles through deep snow just to borrow a shovelful of glowing coals when their own fire went out. The act was as intimate and humbling as borrowing a heartbeat. One traveler in the late 1700s wrote about a man who carried his coals in a small clay pot he called his winter heart, and the phrase spread quietly across settlements because it captured something true. In winter, survival itself had a pulse. You add a thicker stick to the rekindled flame, and listen to the soft pop of sap as it burns. The firelight dances across the logs of the cabin, turning their rough edges golden, and reflects briefly in the frost that rims the inside of the window. Outside, the world looks pale and blurred, as if half asleep beneath its blanket of snow. Inside, your small hearth glows like the center of a universe. Keeping a fire alive through the night required more skill than outsiders might imagine. People learned a technique called banking, covering the burning logs with ashes before sleep, starving them of oxygen, but trapping enough heat to keep the coals alive until morning. The idea seems simple, but it was a balancing act. Too much ash and the fire smothered entirely, too little, and the logs burned too quickly, leaving nothing by dawn. Many families placed a thick log of oak or maple at the base of the fire before banking it. what they called a sleeper log, hoping it would smolder through the long, bitter hours when the world outside froze deeper than thought. Archaeologists have found traces of fire pits dug slightly below floor level in some early cabins, the design meant to radiate heat upward through the room. Scholars still debate whether this came from indigenous influence or old European building traditions adapted to harsher American winters. But the idea itself speaks to the constant ingenuity required to live where a single night of mishandled fire could mean death. Smoke was another silent teacher. Poorly built chimneys sent smoke rolling back into the cabin, stinging eyes, coating walls in soot, and making breathing itself a trial. Settlers learned to read the color of smoke as though it were a message from the fire. Thick white meant moisture or unseasoned wood and long, difficult days ahead. Thin blue meant good fuel and efficient heat. One farmer in the Ohio Valley wrote, "The smoke tells you if the day will be kind," a line that feels strangely poetic for something born of necessity. And then there were the little tricks, half real, half superstition, that spread across frontier families the way old stories often do. Tossing salt into the flames to make them burn cleaner, leaving potatoes near the hearth overnight to absorb dampness, keeping a fire alive at all times to confuse evil spirits, an idea historians still debate, but which people clung to through long, fearful nights. It did not matter whether the belief was logical, it mattered that it comforted those who lived in isolation and silence. You sit now with a tin cup of weak coffee, made from roasted wheat, not beans, because coffee was rare, and let its warmth seep through your fingers. The flames hum softly, their light flickering across the objects around you, the rifle hanging near the door, a row of tin plates on a rough shelf, a drying braid of herbs suspended from a beam. Everything feels suspended in time. In a cabin this small, the fire becomes the center of every thought, every meal, every moment of rest. It is meditation. It is company. It is the thin line separating you from the frozen dark. Outside, dawn gathers strength, turning the snow from blue to silver. You rise, stir the coals once more, and add another log. The flame responds eagerly, a reminder that life continues as long as you feed it. You step back from the hearth and feel its warmth spread through the room, just enough to soften the air, enough to push back the cold waiting outside the walls. As you pull on your boots and coat, you glance over your shoulder at the fire, feeling an odd sense of gratitude, almost reverence. You know now what every frontier family understood in their bones. Winter was a long conversation with the flame, one that demanded patience, respect, and constancy. And as long as the flame answers, you endure. You wake to a sound so faint you almost convince yourself it is part of a dream. A soft, uncertain shuffling in the dark outside the cabin walls, followed by a low rumbling groan that rises and falls like breath caught in a cold throat. For a moment you lie perfectly still beneath your blanket, listening not with your ears but with your whole body, every muscle tuned to the slightest disturbance in the frozen silence. The fire has burned low, the corners of the room are dim, even the dog at your feet lifts its head slowly, ears pricked, sensing what you sense. Then it comes again, deeper this time, unmistakably alive. Your animals. On the early American frontier, the night was never really empty. Every shadow pressed close to every cabin. Every gust of wind could be mistaken for a stalker or a wanderer or a hungry shape waiting just beyond sight. You rise quietly, slipping into your coat, and push open the door just enough for a sliver of cold moonlight to enter. The air outside hits you like a blade, sharp, clean, merciless. Snow lies deep around the cabin, sparkling faintly under the pale sky. Your breath fogs instantly, drifting upward in slow coils that vanish near the eaves. You step out, lantern in hand, and the world narrows to a soft circle of yellow light trembling on the snow. Behind the cabin, in a small lean-to, your cow shifts uneasily, hooves scraping against frozen ground. Chickens rustle in their small coop, feathers shivering. These animals are not ornaments. They are the engine of your survival. A single cow means milk through winter. Chickens mean eggs, and when necessary. Meat, a pig if you're lucky, means fat for cooking, curing, and candles. In this place, animals are warmth, food, security, and sometimes even companionship. Their well-being is your well-being, and yet, they are exactly the thing predators come looking for when hunger drives them from the depths of the forest. Wolves. You hear them before you see anything. The faint crunch of snow beneath padded paws, distant but not distant enough. A soft, sharp sound that carries strangely in the cold air. It is not a threat yet, only a reminder. Wolves have followed livestock scents for as long as cabins have existed. Journal entries from the late 1700s and early 1800s describe families waking to find claw marks on doors, torn fencing, or tracks circling barns in silent, eerie loops. One diary from 1794 tells of a pack that killed every sheep in a small settlement in a single icy night. You tighten your grip on the lantern. The light trembles slightly. Your dog steps forward now, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in its chest. A warning and a promise. Dogs were not luxuries here. They were guardians, partners, alarms. A good dog could save your life by sensing danger long before you did. In countless letters and accounts, settlers wrote about their dogs with a reverence that surprised later historians. The dog as companion, as protector, as the only heartbeat that answered theirs during the loneliest nights. But even dogs grew quiet when wolves approached. You moved toward the lean-to, boots crunching softly. Your cow lifts her head, warm breath rising in a cloud, dark eyes wide and reflecting the lantern light. You run a hand along her flank, feeling the heat beneath her thick winter coat. A living furnace, a fragile one. The cow calms slightly at your touch, but her ears remain pricked, listening, waiting. The wolves do not come closer tonight. You sense them lingering beyond the tree line, shadows moving between deeper shadows, testing the air, testing chance. Some settlers hung strips of leather soaked in tar on fences to ward them off. Others tied bells to livestock, believing the sound repelled predators. Whether any of it truly worked, historians still debate, but fear made people inventive, and fear was justified. You crouch in the snow for a quiet moment, lantern light falling over the prints near the pen. Fresh, crisp, unmistakably wolf. 4 toes, deep in the crust, headed toward your cabin, and then veering away again. A scouting pass. A warning or a promise. You stand slowly, scanning the tree line. The forest looks still, but stillness is a lie in winter. Everything moves with calculation. Predators, prey, even the wind. You listen, and the only sound is the faint groan of snow sliding from a distant branch. The moment stretches, cold and thin. Eventually you turn back toward the cabin, bolting the door behind you. Inside, the fire has burned almost to embers again, but its faint glow feels like the warmest thing you've ever seen. You set the lantern down, hang your coat by the hearth, and sit in the flickering light, letting your breath settle. The dog curls beside you, body pressed against your leg, a silent reassurance. In early frontier journals, animals appear not just as resources but as characters woven into the settlers' emotional lives. A woman in Kentucky once wrote that her hound was the only heartbeat that answers mine when all the land sleeps. Dogs were confidants when people felt isolated. Cows were guardian spirits of the homestead. Even chickens gave a sense of continuity. Small living reminders that not everything in winter was frozen or still. You glance toward the frosted window. Outside, the world is vast and silent. Inside, you have warmth, breath, companionship, fragile but real. As the fire grows dim, you scratch the dog behind its ears and whisper into the quiet room, feeling the truth the settlers learned again and again. Your life is tied to every living creature you keep alive through the winter, and theirs is tied to you. The night settles around the cabin like a heavy blanket, and for now, the thread between life and loss holds. Morning comes heavy and grey, the kind of muted light that makes the world feel suspended between waking and dreaming. The fire in your hearth has burned low again, And your stomach reminds you of another truth the frontier never let anyone forget. Warmth keeps you alive, but food keeps you moving. As you pull on your coat and step outside, the cold presses against your skin like a steady hand, firm and unyielding, urging you to work quickly. The snow stretches in every direction, smooth and glittering, hiding the ground beneath a thick white silence. Your breath rises in pale clouds as you walk toward the storage shed and the cellar door. This is the season when the harvest must stretch through months of bitter weather, when whatever you stored in the fall becomes the difference between endurance and hunger. On the frontier, food preservation wasn't just a chore, it was a strategy, a negotiation with time itself. The air inside the cabin carries faint scents from last night. Smoke, dried herbs and salted meat. But survival through winter requires far more than a few meals. It requires planning layered upon planning, jars upon barrels, racks upon ropes. The settlers learned quickly that nature's generosity ended abruptly with the first frost, and once snow covered the fields, the land offered little except cold, silence, and the occasional rabbit darting across drifts. You turn toward the trapdoor built into the floorboards and lift it carefully. A wave of cold, damp air rises from the cellar beneath, carrying the earthy smell of stored roots and packed straw. Lantern in hand, you descend the creaking ladder into the dim space where the autumn's labor waits quietly in the shadows. Shelves line the walls, each holding the results of weeks of frantic work before winter arrived. Jars of preserved fruits, baskets of potatoes, carrots and turnips buried in straw, crocks of pickles sealed with wax, and bundles of herbs hung to dry. This cellar is more than storage. It is a calendar of survival. Settlers treated their cellars as sanctuaries. The earth provided insulation, keeping food cool but not frozen, humid but not damp enough to spoil. Families often worked in these small underground rooms for hours, organizing, checking for rot, whispering to each other in the quiet. One journal from Vermont describes a woman who sang while she worked among the roots, her voice soft and muffled by the earth. She called it singing to the winter, a habit born less from superstition, and more from a desire to ease the loneliness that crept into every corner of winter life. You run your fingers over a row of wooden barrels. Inside them lies salted pork, not the tender cuts modern kitchens celebrate, but thick slabs heavily cured in salt to keep them from spoiling. Salt itself was a treasure on the frontier, often traded at high cost or carried long distances. Without it, meat would not last, hides could not be preserved, and winter rations would fail long before the thaw. People traveled days to reach salt springs or trading posts, evaporating the briny water in iron pans to gather the crystals that would feed them through the coldest months. You lift a lid from a crock and breathe in the vinegary smell of pickled beans. The sharpness stings your nose but promises a burst of flavor that will cut through the monotony of winter meals. Nearby, strings of dried apple slices hang from rafters, wrinkled and pale but still sweet when soaked in warm water or added to morning porridge. One settler wrote that her apples shriveled like old faces but kept their summer kindness, a line that survived in letters because it captured both the austerity and small comfort of these preserved foods. You pull a jar of sauerkraut from the shelf, its pale shreds suspended in brine. German settlers brought this method across the ocean, and it became a staple in early America. They did not know the word vitamin, but they understood that sauerkraut kept families healthy, warding off scurvy during long months without fresh greens. Today we know it was one of the quiet heroes of frontier survival. Not everything in the cellar lasted as it should. Jars cracked in the frost, meat spoiled when salt was scarce, and sometimes whole barrels had to be thrown out. Illness from bad food was common, and few understood its cause. A doctor's letter from 1812 warned that improperly cured meats have laid many low before the spring, a reminder that survival depended as much on knowledge and intuition as on effort. You climb back into the cabin, carrying a small bundle of potatoes, a slice of smoked pork, and a handful of dried herbs. The fire greets you with a soft crackle as you place the pot over the flame. Soon the scent of simmering broth fills the air, earthy, simple, and comforting. It is not a feast, but it is nourishment heat that begins in the stomach and spreads outward, softening the hard edges of the morning. Outside, the wind rises, brushing snow from the trees in long cascades that shimmer briefly before settling again. You glance toward the door, knowing that once the storms truly arrive, you may not be able to leave the cabin for days. Every jar in the cellar, every strip of smoked meat, every root tucked into straw is a promise, a pact you made with the land. Work while the world is warm, endure when it is not. As you sip the hot broth, steam curling from the bowl, a deep calm settles over you. You think of the settlers who lived through winters harsher than this one, of the hands that jarred apples, salted meat, plucked herbs, and buried root vegetables in dark cellars. They had no guarantee that their work would be enough. They acted anyway. The storm is coming. But so is spring, distant, invisible, but always real. And until then, everything you preserved in the quiet months before winter becomes a testament to the endurance beating steady inside you. The morning sky has turned the pale grey of cold iron, a colour that seems to flatten the entire world into stillness. And as you step outside the cabin, you hear something you have not heard in days, the distant, uneasy groan of the river. Thin sheets of ice cling to its edges like fragile glass, cracking and reforming with each slow movement of the current beneath. You know instantly what that sound means. The river is freezing, and soon the easiest route to the nearest fort or trading post will be sealed beneath solid ice. If there is anything left you need to trade, salt, powder, cloth, candles, this is your last chance. On the frontier, trade was not simply economy, it was survival's final thread. Coins were scarce, sometimes useless. People bartered with pelts, honey, candles, wool, tallow, and the occasional precious handful of dried berries. And when winter closed the land in on itself, cutting trails, freezing rivers, and swallowing footsteps, the world shrank to whatever you had stored inside your walls. You gather the furs you trapped earlier in the season, beaver, fox, muskrat, each one stiff with frost but still valuable, their sheen reflecting the weak morning light. You tie them into a bundle with practiced hands, a small pack but heavy with necessity. Then you begin the walk. The snow crunches beneath your boots with each step, loud in the absolute quiet. The forest feels watchful, its branches weighted with frost. Your breath rises like smoke as you make your way toward the narrow trail leading to the river. Every sound feels amplified in the cold, the caw of a distant crow, the crack of ice shifting on the stream, the faint tremble of wind threading between trees. Travel in winter was always a negotiation with uncertainty. Trails vanished beneath snowdrifts. Ice disguised itself as solid when it was thin as paper. Settlers carried strips of cloth or carved marks into tree trunks to find their way back home. Some survived because of these tricks. Some did not. By midday, you reach the riverbank. The water is sluggish under its forming skin, the ice whispering as it thickens. You test it with your boot. A sharp click, a faint echo from beneath. The river is not fully frozen, but it is close. If you are going to cross, it must be now. You step onto the surface, weight spread carefully, breath held, listening to every sound the ice makes. It groans under you, deep, old, alive, but it holds. On the other side, the trail widens slightly, leading toward the fort several miles upriver. The journey is slow. Snow clings to your boots. The wind steals heat from your hands even through gloves. The sky feels lower, drifting into a heavy overcast that promises a storm. You quicken your pace. Settlers once wrote that walking to a trading post in winter felt like walking to another world, one filled with voices, smoke, and life after days or weeks of isolation. When you finally see the outline of the palisade fence and the faint drift of chimney smoke, a subtle relief settles in your chest. Inside the fort, warmth and noise greet you. The smell of tobacco, wool, damp fur, and cooking stew, voices in English, French, German, and native dialects, the distant ring of a hammer against iron. The trading post is a single room crowded with crates of tools, barrels of flour, bins of salt, rolls of cloth, tins of powder, and small curiosities that settlers rarely admitted they wanted, but always found themselves drawn to. Mirrors, beads, small knives, coloured thread. The trader sits behind a rough counter, a man weathered by winters who looks at your bundle of furs with eyes trained to see value in a heartbeat. He lifts each pelt, runs a thumb along the grain, tests the weight, nods. Trade is quiet, almost ritualistic. You leave with a pound of salt wrapped in cloth, a tin of gunpowder, a spool of thread, new flints, and if luck favours you, a small wedge of precious tea. Luxuries matter on the frontier. They remind you that the world beyond your cabin still exists. As you sit by the hearth in the post, sharing a bowl of stew with a few travellers, you hear their stories of trapped hunters, of a river freezing solid overnight, of wolves following sleds for miles. One man swears he saw lights moving above the trees at midnight, pale and silent like wandering stars. The others laugh, but not entirely. Winter is a place where imagination and truth sometimes cross paths without warning. You know you must leave before the storm sharpens. The wind outside already carries a harsher edge. You step out of the fort and begin the return journey. Your pack now heavier with supplies but lighter on your shoulders for the comfort it brings. When you reach the river, the ice groans again, deeper this time, more insistent. It is thickening fast, and soon it may not tolerate crossing at all. You move quickly, breath short, boots slipping slightly on the frozen surface. The forest on the other side waits in silent patience. Snow begins to fall. Slow at first, then faster. Thick flakes swirling like drifting ash. By the time you see the dark line of your cabin roof through the trees, the world has narrowed to a white blur. Smoke rises weakly from the chimney. You reach the door, shaking off snow as you step inside, greeted by the dim warmth of the fire. You unload your treasures onto the table: salt, powder, tea. Your breath trembling with exhaustion and relief. These small items carry the weight of your next months. They will flavour your food, protect your home, light your nights. Outside, the storm thickens, erasing your tracks, sealing the world again in white silence. You sit by the fire, holding your cup of hot tea, steam rising in slow spirals. You sip carefully, the warmth spreading through you like memory. Every step today was a bargain with the winter. Every trade a quiet promise to endure. And for now, that is enough. The wind whistles through the chinks in the logs again this morning, a thin needling sound that slips beneath your coat and settles cold against your skin. You wake with stiff fingers despite the fire you tended so carefully the night before, and as you sit up on your straw-filled mattress, your eyes drift toward the small pile of clothing stacked neatly beside the bed. There is nothing fancy there. No softness, no unnecessary ornament, only garments made for a single purpose: to keep you alive. On the frontier, fashion is not style. Fashion is survival. You reach for your wool shirt first, its coarse fibers scratching pleasantly against your palms. Most settlers didn't have closets or trunks filled with options. Clothing was spun, woven, dyed, cut, and sewn by hand, every piece a labour that stretched across days of work. In late summer and early fall, spinning wheels hummed in almost every cabin, their rhythmic creak a quiet drumbeat of preparation, as women worked by candlelight, turning flax into linen thread and wool into yarn. The sound of a spinning wheel wasn't just domestic noise, it was the sound of winter insurance. Wool is the backbone of frontier warmth. Thick, heavy, scratchy at times, yes, but it insulates even when wet, a miracle quality in a world where snow melted into clothing with every chore outdoors. Linen shirts sewn from flax made a thin layer close to the skin, breathable but not warm, so they served as the foundation of a survival-minded wardrobe. Over that came wool, then hide, then anything else that provided a barrier against the wind. You dress slowly, layering piece by piece, and feel the weight of it all settle onto your shoulders like a second home, because in truth it is. A frontier saying whispered through generations insisted, dress as if the wind hates you. And on mornings like this, when the cold seems to reach through the walls and press against your spine, the wisdom feels undeniable. Trousers made of rough homespun fabric, a thick wool tunic, a hide coat with seams sewn tightly enough to stop most of the drafts, mittens lined with scraps of rabbit fur, boots stuffed with dry grass for insulation, a trick learned from both indigenous neighbours and generations of European peasants who had faced cruel winters of their own. Grass inside the boots feels strange at first, almost like stepping onto a nest, but the warmth it provides is remarkable. Travellers' journals frequently mention settlers stuffing everything from moss to newspaper into their footwear, creating makeshift padding that trapped heat around their feet even in the deepest snow. One merchant wrote in 1818 that he preferred a Boston Gazette to any blanket for his toes, an odd compliment to a newspaper, but a sincere one. You pull a woolen scarf tight around your neck, the fibres coarse enough to itch slightly but warm enough to silence the complaint. Hats are essential, fur-lined, knitted, or pieced together from scraps of raccoon or rabbit. The famous coonskin cap, later romanticized in stories and paintings, began as purely functional gear. Its long tail meant not for show but to keep snow from slipping down one's back. Many women of the frontier faced an additional challenge. Long skirts, in deep cold, heavy fabric, trapped moisture and stiffened like boards. There are accounts of skirts freezing outward like bells, turning every step into a battle against frost. Some women quietly cut their hems shorter, practicality disguised beneath necessity. Others wore men's trousers beneath their petticoats, an unspoken rebellion historians later called functional defiance. Frontier life blurred boundaries, because survival demanded it. You think of laundry too, another ordeal modern comforts make easy to forget. Water froze before soap could lather. Clothes stiffened into shapes that could stand up on their own if left outside too long. Families often hung garments near the hearth instead, the smell of wet wool mingling with smoke and pine resin. Diaries from the time described the scent as both unpleasant and comforting, a reminder that even in hardship work was being done, progress was being made. You open the cabin door to fetch water, and are greeted by a harsh blast of cold. Snow crunches under your boots as you cross to the frozen barrel near the corner of the cabin. The surface of the water has iced over again, thick enough to require several sharp strikes with a wooden ladle to break through. You scoop the fractured pieces aside and gather the cold water beneath, your reflection trembling in the ripples, your face wrapped in wool and fur, eyes narrowed against the wind, cheeks reddened with a raw, living heat. The figure staring back at you could easily belong to another century. As you return inside, your clothing begins to soften as the heat from the fire meets the cold trapped in each layer. The dog lifts its head, tail beating gently against the floorboards, recognizing the rustle of your coat and the familiar ritual of morning warmth. You hang your scarf near the hearth, its snow melting in slow droplets that slide down the fabric and sizzle quietly when they reach the embers. Frontier clothing was not discarded casually. It was patched endlessly, knee repairs, elbow reinforcements, hems rewritten by hand. Some garments were passed down until they were more patch than original cloth. A good coat could outlive generations. One settler wrote that her father's winter coat had seen more storms than any man in our valley, and she meant it almost literally. As night falls again, you wrap yourself in those same layers, the fire flickering warmly across the room. Outside, the dark deepens, the cold sharpens, and the world narrows to a cabin, a hearth, and the clothing that stands between you and the vast indifferent winter. In these layers, heavy, worn, and stitched with care, you carry the work of your own hands, and the wisdom of those who came long before you. A small, quiet armor against the long dark. Snow has deepened so much now that the world outside your cabin seems to dissolve into a single, unbroken sheet of white. A landscape so quiet and so perfect that it almost feels untouched by time. When you step outside, sound itself seems swallowed, your footsteps vanish instantly beneath soft powder, and even the wind moves gently, hushing itself as though unwilling to disturb the stillness. The air tastes metallic and sharp, Your breath curls upward like smoke from a small chimney, lingering for a moment before disappearing into the muted sky. At first, winter's silence feels peaceful, a welcome pause after weeks of chopping wood, hauling water, tending fires and battling storms. But soon you understand why so many frontier families feared the quiet even more than the cold. The silence grows heavy, thick. It presses against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat more clearly than anything beyond the cabin walls. You begin to realize that the frontier's greatest test is not frostbite or hunger or wolves. It is the loneliness that settles slowly into a person's bones. You walk into the woods behind your cabin, wrapped so tightly in layers that you feel half padded, half armored, like you're carrying your home on your body. Each breath hurts a little as cold needles your lungs. The trees stand tall and motionless, their branches rimmed with ice, the morning light catching each crystal like 1,000 suspended stars. You pause to listen. Nothing. No birds. No flowing water. No crack of a distant branch until suddenly, sharply, a tree somewhere deep in the forest snaps under the pressure of freezing sap. The sound ricochets through the silence like a gunshot, startling you despite its familiarity. The settlers called it the winter's report, a reminder that even the trees were under strain in a season that did not forgive weakness. You keep walking, breath deep, boots crunching softly, but the sound fades too quickly, swallowed again by the stillness. Loneliness was such a constant companion in frontier winters that diaries from the time are filled with small, quiet confessions, things people rarely admitted aloud. One Michigan farmer wrote, "The stillness is not rest but a wait," as though the entire winter were one long moment of holding your breath. A woman in Vermont described talking to her broom as she swept, thankful for even that small reply in her mind. Another settler confessed to pacing the same 10 steps across his cabin so frequently that the floorboards groaned beneath his pattern. You can understand it now. The isolation grows louder the longer you listen to it. Inside your cabin, the silence is different. Not empty, but contained. The fire clicks softly as sap burns inside the logs. The dog shifts in its sleep, paws twitching faintly. The wooden walls expand and contract with the cold, producing long, slow groans that sound almost like voices from another room. Settlers came to understand these sounds as part of winter's vocabulary. They learned to tell the difference between a beam settling peacefully and one shifting dangerously under the weight of snow. During long winters, with trails blocked and rivers frozen, families sometimes went months without seeing neighbors. Letters stopped arriving. Voices other than your own became memories. Some families filled the silence with storytelling, gathering around the fire at night, retelling old folk tales until the figures in the stories felt as real as neighbors. Children listened wide-eyed, watching the firelight move across the walls, transforming shadows into wandering figures and imagined beasts. Even adults leaned on stories. They softened the edges of isolation, but silence, no matter how you fought it, always returned. You walk now along a frozen creek bed, the water beneath locked motionless, translucent as glass. You can see the rocks under the surface, suspended mid-flow, as if time itself has been pinned in place. It reminds you of your own thoughts, still, heavy, waiting. You kneel and toss a pebble across the ice, watching it skitter and bounce before disappearing into a drift at the far edge. The sound is sharp, brief. Then the forest consumes it. When you return to the cabin that evening, the quiet presses closer than before. The fire hums, but its light seems small against the expanse of winter outside. The dog lifts its head and settles it against your knee. You place a hand on its fur and feel a living pulse beneath your fingers, a comfort greater than words. In one of the old journals, a woman wrote during a winter so deep the windows were buried in snow. It is as though we live beneath the earth, buried but breathing still. The line survived because it captured perfectly the frontier winter. Not death, but waiting. Not silence, but suspended life. You sit near the fire and close your eyes. The crackle of burning sap, the faint whistle of wind at the chimney, the soft rhythm of your own breathing. Slowly, quietly, these sounds begin to feel like company, not loud, not bright, but constant enough to remind you that you are still here, still warm, still alive. The silence outside is immense, but inside the cabin, the fire glows. And in that glow, Wintersip's loneliness becomes something you can endure. Not an emptiness, but a companion made of stillness. Night falls thick and absolute, a darkness so deep it seems to swallow the horizon in a single breath. The wind has died completely, leaving the world suspended in a frozen hush. Inside your cabin, the fire burns low but steady, its glow pulsing faintly across the wooden walls like a heartbeat. You sit quietly, listening to the soft crackle of sap inside the logs, letting the warmth soak slowly into your hands after a long day in the snow. Then, 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to tremble through the door. Your chest tightens. No one visits at this hour. You rise carefully, your breath held without meaning to, and the dog lifts its head from the floor, ears pricking toward the sound. A low growl rumbles in its throat, soft, uncertain. You move toward the rifle, leaning against the wall, fingers brushing the stock, not gripping it yet, just grounding yourself in the familiarity of its presence. Another knock. 3 more thuds that seem louder than the first. On the frontier, a late-night visitor could mean almost anything. A neighbor in trouble, a traveler lost, a hunter seeking shelter, or something darker. Someone desperate, someone hungry, someone who has followed the faint trail of smoke from your chimney through the dark. You open the door a crack, just wide enough for a blade of icy wind to slip inside. A figure stands in the snow, wrapped in furs, face half hidden beneath frost and shadow, breath rising in slow, exhausted clouds. For a moment, neither of you speaks, the cold pressing between you like a third presence. Then the stranger's voice emerges, hoarse, wind-burned, brittle from cold. "Evening," he says quietly. Fire still going. You hesitate only a second, because out here hesitation can cost a life, and then step back to let him enter. Hospitality on the frontier isn't just politeness. It's a law shared among the living. Anyone could find themselves lost in a storm one day, and a closed door could mean death. The stranger stamps snow from his boots and steps into the small warmth of the cabin. He smells of leather, frost, and a hint of smoke, as though he has been walking a long, unforgiving distance. He removes his gloves slowly, revealing hands cracked and red from the cold. When he speaks again, his words come out in low, rough fragments. "Lost my way. Storm took the trail. Saw your smoke." You nod, offering him a tin cup of hot broth. He accepts it with trembling fingers and drinks slowly, as if each swallow reaches deeper than the last. The firelight softens his face, a little older than you first thought, lined with hardship, eyes sunken but strangely calm. You sit across from him, both of you silent. The dog watches from the corner, tail still but eyes alert. Outside, the darkness presses against the window panes, as if listening. Encounters like this were common in early America. Quiet, uncertain exchanges between strangers who might never learn one another's names. In countless diaries, settlers described nights spent with unexpected guests who approached like ghosts, stayed for warmth, and vanished at dawn. Sometimes they brought news of a hunting party stranded by ice, of a family's roof collapsing under snow, of wolves gathering close to a settlement. Other times they carried burdens too heavy to name. The stranger sets down the cup, clears his throat. "I sip been walking 2 days," he murmurs. "Trail washed out. Got turned around in the pines. Would sip froze if not for that chimney smoke." There is more to the story. You feel it, but winter teaches people to keep their secrets folded tightly around them. He warms his hands by the fire, and you notice the cuts along his knuckles, darkened by cold. The way he holds one arm close as if something aches beneath the fur. The faint tremor in his shoulders. You pass him a piece of bread, and he eats with quiet concentration, savoring every bite. Outside, a gust of wind pushes snow against the walls, The cabin creaks softly, answering the storm in its wooden language. For a while you talk, slow, cautious talk forged in necessity rather than familiarity. He asks about your animals. You ask how far he travelled. He speaks of deep snow, frozen rivers, distant lights flickering over treetops, northern lights perhaps, or something else entirely. The frontier bred both truth and imagination in equal measure, and winter blurred the line between them. One Pennsylvania journal recounts two traders invited inside for shelter, only for the host to wake and find his horse, coat, and rifle gone. Stories like that travelled quickly, whispered around fires. Trust was never given freely. It was weighed moment by moment, shaped by instinct and the quiet reading of another person's eyes. But tonight, your instinct says this man is simply tired, cold, alone. Hours pass. He speaks less. You speak less. The fire does most of the talking, the flames shifting and popping, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Finally, before dawn, the stranger rises. Storm seps letting up. He says softly, "I still head out before it comes back." You hand him a small wrapped piece of smoked meat, provision for the road. He accepts with a nod that carries more gratitude than words. When he opens the door, cold air rushes in again, sweeping the warmth aside for a brief instant. You watch him step into the snow, lantern glow flickering against his back. He moves slowly toward the tree line, and then he is gone, swallowed by darkness. By the time morning fully arrives, only a faint trail of footprints remains, and when you follow them a few steps into the forest, they fade abruptly beneath drifting snow, ending in a blank, untouched field. Such stories appear again and again in frontier lore. Travelers who arrived from nowhere, warmed themselves by a stranger's fire, and left without leaving a trace. Historians argue endlessly whether these were real events or dreams born from isolation. But every settler believed in them because winter itself blurred reality into something half waking, half myth. Back inside, you stir the fire and sit quietly as warmth fills the room. Outside, the wind howls softly, and somewhere far away a lone wolf calls once, then fades into silence. You think of the stranger, of the fire you shared, and of how the frontier turns every meeting into a test of faith. Tonight you are alone again, yet not entirely. Some part of his presence lingers, warm as the last ember in your hearth. You wake slowly into a pale, uncertain morning. The kind of morning where light does not so much enter the cabin as seep reluctantly through the frost-laced window panes, and almost instantly you feel a soreness behind your eyes, and a heaviness in your chest that does not belong to simple fatigue, but to the quiet, creeping onset of sickness. A presence as stealthy and merciless as the winter itself, slipping into your body the way cold air slips through chinks in the wall, unnoticed at first and then suddenly everywhere. The room around you feels smaller than it did yesterday, the air close and faintly stale, as if the illness has thickened it, and when you sit up your breath emerges in a thin fog that lingers in the frigid air before dissolving into nothing. You wrap a shawl around your shoulders, feeling a dull ache pulsing deep in your bones, the type of ache settlers feared more than snowstorms or wolves, because it signaled that winter had found a weakness in the body and intended to exploit it. On the early American frontier, illness was not an inconvenience. It was an adversary that moved silently through families and communities, thriving in the close air of small cabins, turning simple coughs into fevers and fevers into something darker, long before anyone fully understood how sickness spread or how to treat it. And because doctors lived days or weeks away by foot or sled, people learned to rely on their own knowledge, their own herbs, their own half-remembered stories of cures whispered from one generation to the next. You move slowly toward the hearth, each step heavier than the one before, and kneel beside the fire that barely clings to life beneath a thin layer of ash. You stir it gently, coaxing a few fading coals into a fragile glow, and the first flicker of new flame warms your face just enough to ease the tightness in your chest, though only slightly, as if even the fire must work harder to reach you. now that illness sits like a weight within your ribs. On a wooden beam above the hearth hangs a small collection of dried herbs: mint, wintergreen, mullein, yarrow, gathered months ago during the brief green season when the world felt generous rather than hostile. And you remember how settlers carefully dried and bundled such plants, not only for flavoring stews, but as medicine for the long months of cold when sickness was as common as snowfall. Some believed these herbs carried the memory of summer inside them, a warmth that could reach places fire could not. You crush a few brittle leaves into a pot of water and set it over the flames, watching as the steam begins to rise with a sharp green scent that cuts through the thick air, and for a moment you let your eyes close, allowing the warmth to seep into your palms, imagining the countless men and women who once sat exactly as you do now, on the edge of a bed or by a dying fire, brewing whatever remedies they had not, because they were certain it would work, but because doing nothing felt like surrender. Settlers' journals describe an astonishing array of home remedies: sassafras tea for fever, onion syrup for cough, vinegar compresses for aching joints, pine resin salves for infections. And though few understood the science beneath their practices, they understood necessity, intuition, and the quiet wisdom passed through families. Many of these cures probably helped, some undoubtedly did little, but all carried with them a sense of agency in a wilderness where so much was beyond anyone's control. You take a sip of the steaming brew, the bitterness pressing against your tongue before sliding down your throat with a heat that feels both comforting and harsh, as though the herbs are battling something inside you, and you imagine all the whispered advice that frontier women gave each other. Keep warm stones wrapped in cloth near the chest, drink broth slowly, breathe steam from pine needles, sleep near the fire, never let yourself grow cold even for a moment. Each suggestion both practical and deeply human. Yet illness on the frontier had another layer of danger, one that had little to do with remedies and everything to do with isolation. When you were sick, chores did not cease, fires did not tend themselves, animals did not feed themselves, water did not gather itself from the frozen barrel outside, and so every wave of fever or dizziness carried the added fear that you might not have the strength to perform the tasks that separated survival from disaster. You sit by the fire for a long moment, holding the cup between your trembling hands, listening to the faint creak of settling logs, feeling the dog press its warm body against your feet, as if sensing your weakness. And in that simple act you find a quiet comfort, because settlers often relied on their animals not only for labor but for companionship during illness. Soft breaths in the dark, the weight of a head resting on a knee, a reminder that they were not entirely alone. On a small shelf rests a notebook you keep for practical matters, much like the ones early families kept. Lists of food stores, notes about the weather, reminders of what needs repair when spring returns. But now your eyes drift to its blank pages, imagining the countless unnamed men and women who wrote about their own winters, their own sicknesses, their own fragile attempts to persist through months, where each day felt like a small test of endurance. One such notebook from the 1790s records a woman's cure for lung fever, a mixture of onion syrup, bear grease, and vinegar, though she does not say whether it saved the patient or merely offered comfort while the illness ran its course. Your breath comes heavier now, each inhale tugging at your ribs like a stubborn knot, and you find yourself leaning closer to the fire, its warmth, the only steady presence in the room. The flame flickers, dances, sways, as if breathing with you, and as the shadows shift along the walls, you feel a strange sense of companionship, a recognition that this very posture, sick, quiet, wrapped in blankets beside a winter hearth, is one shared across centuries by countless people who survived winters with less knowledge than we have now, but more resilience than most can imagine. A sudden gust of wind presses against the cabin, rattling the shutters and sending a thin draft across the floorboards, and you feel the cold slip under your blanket and brush your skin, reminding you how fragile the boundary is between warmth and suffering. You rise only long enough to place another log on the fire, the movement dizzying, your breath shallow, your heartbeat echoing in your ears like a slow drum. When you settle back onto the bed, cradling the warm mug, your thoughts drift without direction, carried by fever, fatigue, and the soft glow of the flames. You understand now, in a way you hadn't before, how illness blurred reality for settlers, turning long nights into half-dreams filled with strange images, whispered prayers, and the crackling lullaby of burning wood. Outside, the snow continues to fall in gentle, endless layers, covering the world in silence. But inside, the fire glows, the herbs steep, and your breath, labored but steady, threads itself through the quiet. Winter has decided to test you, but you are still here, wrapped in warmth, holding on to the small rituals that kept generations alive before you, waiting for the fever to break the way ice breaks under the first soft touch of spring. You drift in and out of shallow sleep as the fever rises and falls in slow, uneasy waves, each one blurring the edges of the room a little more until the cabin around you seems to sway gently like a boat in distant waters. And when you finally open your eyes again, the fire has burned down to faint glowing coals barely bright enough to cast a shadow. The light is so weak that for a moment you wonder if dawn has come, or if night has simply lingered too long, unwilling to release its hold on the small wooden shelter that stands stubbornly against the cold. Your throat feels dry, your limbs heavy, and when you sit up, the motion sends a dull ache through your chest that makes you pause and breathe carefully, slowly, as if each inhale must be negotiated with the cold air. The dog lifts its head and watches you with worried eyes, sensing the shift in your body, and edges closer, pressing its warm side against your leg in a gesture that asks nothing and offers everything: company, warmth, the reminder that you are not entirely alone in this long, fragile moment. Outside, the world is quiet, but it is not the same silence you heard before illness took hold. This quiet has weight, as though the snow has settled into every hollow and crevice of the land, softening every sound until even the wind seems reluctant to disturb the stillness. You turn toward the window and see frost etched across the glass in delicate branching patterns that look almost like feathers or pale winter leaves, each line shimmering faintly with reflected firelight. On the frontier, people often believed frost patterns carried messages, nature's script written on glass. Some said they foretold storms. Others claimed they were merely the breath of winter drawing maps no one could follow. You feel a chill pass through you, not from the wind but from within, and reach for another blanket, draping it over your shoulders before leaning close to the hearth. Reviving a dying fire while sick feels like lifting a stone with bare hands, but you know the cost of letting flames die entirely. The cold would seep into your bones with a swiftness no remedy could counter. So you gather a few thin slivers of wood, the driest you can find, and carefully arrange them atop the faint glow of coals, blowing gently until the ember brightens, then brightens more, until at last a thin flame curls upward like a soft exhalation. The warmth grows slowly, and you settle beside it, clutching a cup of water warmed just enough to ease your throat. Your eyes wander to the shelf where your small bundle of herbs hangs, the dried leaves curled inward as though clinging to their own memories of sunlight. You take a pinch of mullein and wintergreen, steep them in a fresh pot of water, and let the steam rise toward your face. The smell is sharp and almost medicinal, but it clears your breath just enough to soothe the tightness in your chest. Frontier families relied on such herbs not simply because they lacked alternatives, but because the land itself felt like an ally when sickness came. Plants were more than remedies. They were anchors, small pieces of the warm season preserved to counter winter's cruelty. Some settlers believed each plant carried a memory of summer within it, a fragment of sunlight stored in leaves and roots, and though the belief was poetic rather than scientific, it provided comfort during long nights when fever blurred the border between reality and imagination. You sip the bitter tea slowly, the heat traveling down your throat into the tight ache in your chest, and you find yourself remembering stories passed down through journals, stories of people fighting illness with whatever they could gather: broth made from marrow bones, heated stones wrapped in wool, and placed against the ribs, poultices of pine resin and bear fat pressed gently onto the skin. None of it was easy, none of it certain, but all of it came from a determination to live when winter seemed intent on claiming otherwise. A gust of wind presses hard against the cabin walls then, making the shutters tremble and the entire structure creak like a tired old ship. You close your eyes, feeling the draft brush across your feet despite the fire, and imagine how many night settlers whispered small prayers to the logs themselves, asking the walls to hold, the chimney to stay firm, the fire to last, the illness to break. Your fever climbs again for a moment, sending a shiver up your spine that forces you to lie back, watching the ceiling blur slightly as the room sways in slow motion. You breathe carefully, letting each inhale settle before inviting the next, and gradually the dizziness passes enough that you can sit up again, leaning against the wall where the wood is cold but solid beneath your shoulder. The dog shifts closer, placing its head gently on your thigh, its warm breath a quiet reassurance. In many frontier letters, people wrote about how their animals seemed to understand illness better than humans, how dogs would lie beside the sick, refusing to move even for food, how horses would grow uncharacteristically calm near feverish owners, how cows would linger near cabin doors on nights when someone inside was unwell. Companionship, settlers believed, was its own kind of medicine. As the fever ebbs and flows, your thoughts drift to the world outside, the snow piling in silent layers, burying tracks and paths, the trees standing still beneath their white burden, the river frozen into a glassy ribbon of ice, the distant hills softened into shapeless mounds beneath the weight of winter. Out there, in that quiet expanse, nothing stirs, but inside, the small circle of warmth around the hearth feels like defiance against the vast silence. You watch the fire for a long time, letting the rhythm of its flickering lull you into a state halfway between waking and sleep, and in that gentle haze you begin to sense something that all settlers eventually learned. Winter sickness is not a single battle but a long conversation between body and season, a slow negotiation in which strength returns not in leaps but in faint ripples that must be noticed, nurtured, and protected. Eventually you sip another mouthful of the bitter tea, letting its warmth spread, and although your breath still rasps faintly, and your limbs still ache, you feel a small but real shift inside you, a loosening, a softening, a gentle reminder that even winter must obey time's forward pull. You lean your head back against the log wall and close your eyes, the fire murmuring softly beside you, the dog breathing steadily at your feet, and illness, though still present, no longer feels quite as heavy as it did in the grey, uncertain hours before dawn. The world outside remains frozen, silent, and immense, but inside, the smallest ember of strength has begun to glow again.